Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to welcome everybody here tonight as we are celebrating this is technically a pre-publication event. The launch date kept getting pushed back. In case, by the way, you were planning on purchasing books for holiday gifts this year, buy early because the printing industry is having some hiccups in their supply lines, so buy early. This book was supposed to be a launch week event, but it got pushed back a couple weeks. We are still here. Our books actually showed up on time. So we have been very pleased. If you purchased the book from Gibson's already, we have them. We're shipping them out to you. We have permission from the publisher. And we are all here tonight to celebrate this book with the author in conversation. I would like to our attendees, I would like to direct your attention. There's a chat sidebar over on the side. If you have questions during this event, please do tuck them into the chat sidebar or the Q&A box. But tonight we are very pleased to welcome our author this evening, Thomas Wessels, as we present his book, New England's Roadside Ecology, exploring 30 of the region's unique natural areas. He is joined by a friend, a longtime U.S. Forest Service employee and noted North Country naturalist, David Govatski. Welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we're so excited to jump into this. Please, David, Tom, take it away.
Sure. Tom, you've got 30 unique sites that you picked in New Hampshire. Can you tell us the criteria you used to pick these sites?
Yeah, and actually it's not just New Hampshire, Dave, it's for all the New England states.
That's right, all the New England states, yes.
There are 6 sites in New Hampshire though. So basically this idea was spawned by the Roadside Geology series. Many states have them. And that book directs you to roadside stops where you can get out of your car and look at like an interesting rock outcropping or something like that. I just took it a little bit further. The stops for this book occur at a trailhead parking lot that takes people on a trail into a very unique natural area. And I mean, there's tons of them in New England, but I'm really focusing on ones here that have pretty good hardened trail systems. And for the most part are trails that are easy to moderate, averaging maybe about 2 miles in length. So there's a lot of very cool natural areas, but a lot of them you have to, sort of work your way to get to quite far in. So these are going to the ones that are close by to the roads.
Okay, and some of my favorite ones are there. I think I've done 20 out of the 30 that you have there. So I think I'm going to have to go on a road trip here this fall to catch up on some of the others. But one of the things I really liked was that you started the book off with an introduction to the natural features that were commonly found in many of these sites throughout the book. And I really liked it. And I think the reader is going to like it too, because so many people will walk down a trail and will miss out on these wonderful natural features, like at the Vernon Black Gum Swamp in Vermont that you featured. You've got a nice photograph of rows of holes that were created by a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And I think this is going to be a good opportunity for kids. They'll take a look at the book, they'll look at the pictures, and they'll start looking for these things that you describe. And I really like that.
Yeah, well, that first chapter, I can't take the credit for. I think it's called Features Focus.
Yes.
And I had a really wonderful editor at the Timber Press, Julie Talbot, and she kept noticing that in a lot of the sites, the same sorts of things were coming up, multiple or coppice trees, multiple trunk trees or coppice trees or things like that. And so she actually drafted that first chapter. She pulled all those pieces in and said, take a look at this, Tom, and you can edit it any ways you want, or we don't even have to use it. But I think it might be useful to give people up front sort of a handle on these common features they're going to see, so you don't have to explain them time and time again in the text. So it was a great thing that she did. I've never had an editor go that far in terms of working with the book, and I really was pleased with it. So I think it is a good beginning.
It sure is. Well, let's talk about one of the local sites, at least here in New Hampshire and in the Concord area. You have the Manchester Cedar Swamp, which is almost in downtown Manchester. Would you care to mention a few things about that particular place?
Well, it's a fairly diverse site. So, I mean, the name is the Manchester Cedar Swamp. The Cedar Swamp itself is relatively small, and it's in one section of the preserve, which actually I think is about 1,000 acres. So the trail that we're doing only goes through one corner of the preserve, but still you go through a diverse array of stuff. So you can see not just that cedar swamp, which has very, very old Atlantic white cedars, and you can tell that because there's a very tight spiral going up their trunks. And when you see that, you're looking at older trees. At the start of that swamp, it has a very old black gum that's probably in the 300 to 400-year-old range. And then there's a nice stand with bare oak, or what's called scrub oak, which you see in very sort of dry acidic sites. There's a nice ester community. So there's just a lot of diversity in there. Again, the trail is easily traversed. This one I think is, if I remember correctly, about a 2.5 mile length. It's like a figure 8, but it's just a mile outside the center of the city, and it's a great resource. And we've been talking about this already. I mean, the Nature Conservancy is going to make that handicap accessible, and they're going to make it accessible. You told me this, by bus from town, which I think is great, because the original, I mean, when I was there, the trailhead parking was sort of small, so that they can bring people out by bus. I think just a brilliant idea.
It sure is, and the Nature Conservancy is started the work on that. Hopefully, it'll be done by October, and I think the project cost was somewhere around $700,000, and they're raising the money to really make it quite a impressive trail. They're calling it an all-persons trail, and I'm sure the work will look really good. You recently were featured on a YouTube video for one of the other sites in the southwestern corner of the state, Pisgah State Park, and I enjoyed seeing that video before I got a copy of your book. And you had the mystery of those concrete structures that were in there, and you had some old growth features and that. So I would encourage potential readers to check out the YouTube video. What about the Pisgah State Park? That's a big 13,000 acre state park, some old growth in there, pretty interesting habitat.
Yeah, it's actually the second largest state park in New England. Only Baxter is larger. So, and I think the real amazing thing about that park is a large chunk of the western side of the park was never opened up for agricultural land. It's about 6,000 acres that has always been forested. That's where you find these embedded stands of old growth. There was quite a bit more before the hurricane of 38, but there's still at least 4 stands I'm aware of in there that are old growth stands. It has a lot in there you don't normally see because of the age of the forest. So and I think actually when you get up onto Mount Pisgah and you're looking east, it's probably the most wilderness viewscape I've seen just about anywhere in New England. I mean, you don't see any roads. You see one cell tower way off in the distance, and you see one hayfield, probably about 10 or 11 miles away. And yet you're looking over a fairly populated area. You're looking right over Keene, New Hampshire, but you can't see any evidence of it because it's tucked down in the landscape. So it has a lot of exquisite features.
It sure does. You had 2 other sites in the southwestern corner. You have Rhododendron State Park, or State Botanical Area, which is one of my favorite spots. It's particularly nice in July to see, and Wantastiquet Mountain, which is across from Brattleboro, Vermont.
Yeah, the Rhododendron State Park is really unique because we have, I think, 6 native stands of rhododendron in New England, and this is the largest one. So it's quite impressive. And there's areas in it where you literally are walking in a tunnel. The trail basically is a tunnel under the rhododendrons. I mean, it's completely arcing over you, which gives a really nice effect. And it also has a part of the park also has another black gum swamp in it with old trees. And there's also a nice section that has an interesting agricultural history that you can read, which the chapter goes into.
Right. And that introduction that you have in the book, you talk about agriculture and how to identify particular kinds of stone walls and where there were the pillow and cradle features in the landscape. And again, I found that helpful, and I'm sure the reader's going to find that very helpful too, to understand how to read agricultural history.
Yeah, and that comes up in a lot of the sites because 80% of pretty much lower elevational parts of the central and southern parts of New England were open agricultural land.
Sure.
So it's a pretty common feature.
And over in Cape Cod, I know a lot of the listeners vacation at Cape Cod. You picked 3 very, very nice sites. The Dune Shack Trail. I liked how you put in the Fibonacci number system and counting the pitch pine cones and getting into that mathematical sequence. I think that's really good for parents to work with their children to introduce this mathematical concept, which is somewhat common in nature, and many people don't know about it.
It's very, very common. So the Fibonacci series, for people that don't know it, goes 1. It's a number series. It goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and to get the next number of the series, you just add the 2 previous ones. But what's interesting, whenever you get interlocking spirals in nature, so those pitch pine cones, each scale is the crossroads of a clockwise and counterclockwise spiral. So if you count the number of clockwise spirals going all around the cone and then the counterclockwise ones, there'll always be 2 contiguous numbers in the Fibonacci series. You can see this in a lot of things. Any like a sunflower
Sure.
seed head, same thing. Each sunflower seed is the intersection of a clockwise and counterclockwise spiral. On young balsam fir trees, you can see this in their lenticels. You'll see clear spiraling of the lenticels in both directions. So whenever you get these interlocking spirals in nature, there are always going to be 2 consecutive numbers in the Fibonacci series.
Sure. And speaking of spirals, Atlantic white cedar and northern white cedar, the spirals in the bark. You mentioned that in the book a couple times. Atlantic white cedar tends to spiral to the left, where most trees tend to spiral to the right.
Yeah, Atlantic white cedar is the oddball. From my counts, regardless of species, other than Atlantic white cedar, about 90% spiral to the right as you look up the tree, and about 10% to the left, very much like right-handedness and left-handedness in people. But definitely Atlantic white cedar is the odd tree out, because it's going mostly always to the left. Now, that spiral, all trees have it. On most trees, you can't see it unless the tree has been hit by lightning, which will follow that spiral pattern in the trunk wood, or unless the tree has died and the bark has fallen off, because in most trees that spiral is hidden. But it's part of a tree's phyllotaxy, so that as it grows up, the limbs are not right above each other. Because of the spiral, they start getting offset, and that maximizes for solar gain. So it comes up a lot. I mean, there's a lot of trees, photographs in this book that show trees that have been hit by lightning, and you can clearly see it's following that spiral path.
And you also feature earth stars as one of the features to look for on the Dune Shacks Trail.
Yeah, and they're cool because they're a puffball, but they're a fungus that can move. If they get enough moisture, the arms of the earth star pushes down and detaches itself from the mycelium, so then it can be blown across the dunes, spreading its spores as it goes.
Yeah, just an amazing bit of natural history information. And just not too far from there in Provincetown, you have the Beach Dunes Trail. That's featured in the book. I enjoyed that. I always hike that trail whenever I'm on the Cape. I'll make the long drive out there to the point and hike it. You like it too, it appears.
I mean, what it is, it's showing what that part of the Cape out in the province land used to look like. It was pretty much all beach dominated forest pre-European settlement. Or I guess maybe American settlement when I can't remember when Provincetown was settled, but one of the two. because, you know, succession had stabilized all those dunes. So the Dune Shack Trail was the result of settlement that basically, you know, deforested that area and put it back into active dunes. So it's a nice contrast to see, you know, an area where the dunes were stabilized. And it's amazing to me that on basically pure sand, it can support a quite a vigorous forest ecosystem.
Yeah, it amazes me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of beach, you featured one of the sites that I haven't been to. I think it's the Oakland Forest in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
And I was amazed that there's a potential old growth American beech forest. They appear to be doing pretty well, and whereas in many places in the Northeast, we're dealing with the beech bark scale nectaria complex. Care to talk about that situation?
Yeah, well, you know, I think, well, beech bark scale nectaria or beech bark scale disease was brought into North America on a load of beech logs that came into Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1890. It made it down into our central region of New England by about the time of World War II. And so the scale insect can be seen as little white dots on the bark of beech. And in their own right, they're not too much of a problem. They have a long stylet that goes through the bark and they suck the sap of the tree, but they tend to be sedentary. Their populations build up, and then there's so many of them, they compromise the bark, and then the nectaria fungus can move in, which then actually cracks the bark and allows our native fungi to move in. And eventually these beech get such an amount of decay that they sort of snap off at mid-trunk height. I think what the Oakland Forest in Rhode Island shows is not only the ecological values we're losing by losing the beech, but the aesthetic value. I mean, here is this, our sole interior forest tree with absolutely smooth, light gray bark. And when you see these big old growth trees that are probably good 300 years of age with this smooth gray bark, it's striking because we just don't get to see that anymore, really. It's really something. Because another site in New Hampshire I cover is the Dry River Old Growth Stand, and the beech are completely gone from there because they have succumbed to it. Luckily, this population of beech down in Portsmouth, Rhode Island is disjunct, and that disease has not gotten there. And I hope it never does, but it may. But it is something to see.
What do you think the outcome is going to be on the beech stands that we have here in New Hampshire and Vermont?
Well, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, hopefully something will come about that can figure out maybe how to eat the scale insect and decrease their populations. I mean, something's going to have to happen, because if something doesn't kick into gear, it's the one tree pathogen that really worries me. I think all of our other tree pathogens are eventually going to, our trees are going to be okay. It's going to take a long time, centuries, but coevolution is going to push them to work that out. But right now, natural selection seems to be selecting for non-resistant beech and not the resistant ones, because as a beech sickens and dies, it root sprouts. And so it sends up this dense understory of root sprouts, which are genetically the same as the parent tree. And they succumb to the blight. And then the understory root sprouts get even denser. And eventually it becomes almost like an invasive understory species that doesn't allow the nuts of resistant trees to germinate within it. So these clones spread out, and resistant, seedlings decline. And so it's a very worrisome situation.
It's such an important species for things like black bear and turkeys and others who feed on the beech nuts. It has such a high fat and protein content.
Yeah, and from witness tree surveys. So when proprietors were first setting up towns and they were putting out 60-acre parcels to be deeded to people back like in the 1600s, 1700s, the corners of those parcels were written into deeds by the witness trees that were there. And by looking at those old deeds, we can find that beech was one of the most common forest trees in New England at the time of colonization. And so that's a real sad change to see it now really declining like this.
It certainly is. And you've written several books. Reading the Forested Landscape. I think that was the first book that I read, and many of the listeners tonight, I'm sure, have read that and enjoyed it. And Forest Forensics, another one of my favorite books. And it looks as if, that's a lot of the theory there. And this book, The Roadside Ecology, actually takes a person who wants to go to these sites and actually applies that. And you can actually see what's out there on the ground. It's like having a nature guide with you. And so I think it's going to be a very, very valuable book for that particular purpose.
Yeah, well, that was the intent. And it's really an interpretive trail guide to the, really wonderful natural history, ecology, even some of the cultural history you can see while walking the trail. So it is an interpretive guide, and each chapter has about 10 photographs that, point out some of these cool things, but also can be used as reference points. So where you know where you are on the trail in reference to the text of the book.
Right. And it's probably the equivalent of a course at Antioch, New England College, where you formerly taught.
Maybe, I don't know. Part of one, maybe. I'm probably not getting into the theory as much as I should, because it's, when we first got this idea, Timber Press, they liked it, and they said, all right, let's run with, 30 sites, and we want to keep them to all, 10 pages or less.
Sure.
So I can't get as much into the theory as I normally would, but.
Right. And I see that Timber Press, which is based in Portland, Oregon, has another one in the works. It's the Washington and Oregon Roadside Ecology. I signed up for a copy of that because I tend to go out there to visit family each year. So I'm looking forward to seeing that come out next spring.
Well, that was the idea. When they got this, they said, well, we really want to make this into a series, so that there'll be a series of them for the whole country. They also have, so I didn't even know that was going to be published this spring. I knew they had someone working on it. Then you told me, oh, it's coming out in March. I thought, wow, that was fast work. And they've also got someone signed up working on California now, and eventually they'll work their way across the country and have each region have its own roadside ecology, sort of based on this model that I developed. So that's sort of cool. And now they're so excited about it, they want to do a similar thing for the national parks. They want to do like a similar book on the roadside ecology in the national parks. So that'll be sort of interesting as well.
What a great idea. And how about a volume 2 for New England?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. They've asked me to do other sections of the country. It would just take me way too long to go to, let's say, Washington, Oregon. I mean, I know a lot of sites there, but I'd have to peruse them all. And it'd be like, I'd have to be there for half a year. But all of a sudden, this idea about national parks, well, that's way different, because national parks don't have extensive road systems for the most part. They're somewhat limited to maintain the integrity of the park. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, wow, I think I could probably do a national park, especially ones I know, like Rocky Mountain or Grand Teton.
Sure.
So a number of them I do know quite well. I could probably do them in a week or two. I could go out and do it. And so I might be doing more of these. Who knows?
Well, we hope you will. Some of the other sites, how about in Maine? Did you have a Mount Agamenticus? It's one of my favorite hikes on the coast of Maine.
Yeah, Mount Agamenticus I felt had to be in there because it has the highest plant species richness of any spot in Maine. So you get a real mixing of species there. You get southern species like chestnut oak mixing with more northerly species like red spruce. And there's a lot of things going on there. So I had to include that. There's also 2 really wonderful sites with boardwalks in bogs. They're the Saco Heath, right, which is the most southern raised bog in North America, and also the Orono Bog, which has a really wonderful boardwalk as well. So
and it's a long one too.
They both are. The Saco Heath out and back is a mile, and I would say the Orono Bog is probably 3/4 of a mile out and back. So,
yeah, they're wonderful, and they're well built and wonderful places. Yeah. How about Sur de Monts at Acadia and Gorham Mountain?
Yeah. So those 2 are in Acadia. I mean, there's Other ones I could include in Acadia, but some of them for personal reasons, I'm not including. I don't have a ton of people going there, but
You can tell me later.
yeah, the Dora Mountain already has a lot of people hiking it, and I wanted to get people out and expose granite ridges that were glacially scoured. And Sierra de Mont is interesting because it has a real interesting fire history and a complex of old growth, younger forest from the fire, as well as a variety of different marsh and swamp ecosystems, all in a very easy 1 mile figure 8 loop. So it just had a lot going on there.
It certainly does. And Great Loss Island, I was out there again this summer. Again, a wonderful place. That was one of the longer hikes. Not a lot of elevation gain, but a little bit up and down. But it's a fabulous place for botany and wildflowers and trees and seeing the ocean.
It is. I mean, and it has, I think, the most wilderness feel of all the sites, because you're really going through a exquisite boreal forest dominated by black spruce and jack pine. It's something you'd see much more commonly way further north into Canada, but because of the cold ocean, you have it right there. And it doesn't get a lot of use. So when you're out in that 2 mile trail getting out to the coast, you really feel like I could be anywhere, like out there. It does feel sort of wild. And then once you get out to the coastline, you have two options. You can just turn around and come back the way you came in, or if you're a little more adventuresome, you can do the loop all the way around the point, which instead of being a 4 mile round trip walk would be now a 5.5 mile loop. But it is exquisite because you have just this elegant granite coastline where early on the bedrock is just glacially scoured and just sloping just gently down in the water. So it's almost like you have a granite beach instead of a sand beach. It is really quite exquisite to see.
Yeah, the glacial geology history is quite fascinating. You cover that in many of your 30 sites, covering the geology and the geomorphology.
Yeah, well, it's basically the geomorphology. That's the shared, I guess, heritage of this region. The whole thing was glacially scoured and has glacial deposition on it, like all that sand dune that is down in the Cape. That all came down out of the White Mountains. Basically scoured up the granites of New Hampshire and then deposited down there.
Sure. And how about some of the sites in Connecticut? Now, did you know about these sites before, or did you research?
I knew one out of the three, the Cathedral, the Pines, and Cornwall, because I used to go in there years ago.
Before it blew down.
Yeah, and I can remember the storm that took that down. I was down in the region, and I heard that it had gotten damaged. So I went right down the next day, and I was shocked to see that this really exquisite old growth stand of white pine pretty much got leveled. Although there is, I would say, probably still remaining maybe about 10 acres or so of old growth there. So you can see what it did look like. But the other two sites actually were given to me by one of my former grad students, the Henry Buck Trail in Barkhamsted and the Tyler Mill Preserve. Henry Buck Trail is really something because it takes you adjacent to a calcium-enriched old-growth forest. It's probably one of the best developed ones I've ever seen in all of New England. I wouldn't have expected it was down in Connecticut, but it is. And then the Tyler Mill Preserve is a trap rock ridge that has just a real diverse array of communities on its flanks and down below it. So it was another real good jewel for the collection. Yeah,
the pictures really show that Tyler tract in the trap rock. I haven't been to that one. I would really like to go and see that.
Yeah, I didn't know about it at all. When I did research, it's like known because it's a big mountain biker mecca. But my grad student said, no, Tom, you're gonna like it. Don't worry about the mountain bikes. They don't really go on the Trap Rock Ridge, and that's where the cool stuff is. So. Yeah,
did you see any copperheads down there?
I didn't, but they should be there. I didn't.
They should be there. They love that Trap Rock country. Yeah. Yeah, and how about Vermont? You got a half dozen sites in Vermont. You've got the Montshire Museum trails just across the river from Hanover in Norwich, Vermont. You talk a lot about the hurricane of 1938 for that particular trail walk.
Yeah, and that it comes up in a lot of these sites. You know, just after, I guess, Ida, uh, it might put the Hurricane 38 in perspective. It was believed to be somewhere in a category 4 to 5 storm when it made landfall. I think the highest wind speed from Ida was 172 miles an hour, but with the Hurricane of 38, the Blue Hill Observatory south of Boston picked up a wind speed of 186 for the 38 hurricane. And the other thing that was unique about it was the rate of speed that was advancing with. It was moving northward at about 40 miles an hour. So it was like this juggernaut coming in. And because of that, its storm surge, which over in Rhode Island was over 20 feet, was more like sort of a tsunami. That storm surge came up in less than a minute. And I think a big tragedy about that event was that the storm was predicted to turn out to sea well south of Long Island, and yet it did the opposite. It went like Henri did, you know, in New England. It turned to the northwest and came in going right diagonally over New England. And I think the bulk of the 700 fatalities happened within a minute of landfall, where people were down and watching the big surf coming in and got hit by the storm surge and just
they didn't expect that really big surf to come in and wipe them out. Communications weren't what they are today.
No, they're not. And you know, the meteorological means of watching these things is not what it is today.
You picked a number of bog sites. Philip Crescenti Bog near New London, again, one of my favorite places. Wonderful trail system there that the Conservation Commission, I believe, maintains. Tell us about Philip Crescenti.
Well, it is. It's a bog that is not as well known, and I debated about whether I should put it in or not, because it is a very quiet place. Not a lot of people go there, but I thought, you know, if people are really careful and they stay on the boardwalk, it can handle it. And so I decided to include it because it really is an exquisite bog and has a lot of really cool features, both in the bog and surrounding the bog proper.
Did you have any concerns? You mentioned a little bit in the book about, you know, discussing some of these particular sites, and your feeling, I think, was that, well, part of the purpose of the book is to encourage people to visit, but to do it in a cautious and careful way.
So as I mentioned, most of the sites, the vast majority, have really good hardened trails that can handle a lot of people. There are some sites like the, you know, Philip Crescenti Bog and some other ones that maybe not as quite as hardened as like the Orono Bog or the Saco Heath. But the introduction really stresses that if people are going to go to these places, they are very special places. They need to really respect them and stay on the trail and never walk on any of the vegetation. You know, it was killing me when I went up to do the Orono Bog site. I was walking down the swamp portion of the boardwalk before it gets in the open bog, and people had walked off the boardwalk to get pictures of wildflowers, and they had trampled this very fragile vegetation. And if they'd just been a little bit more patient, they would have gotten really good shots right next to the boardwalk where they didn't have to get off. And so I'm hoping that, you know, at first I did debate about this book, whether I should do it or not, but I thought, you know, I think that if we can teach people really good trail etiquette and they can teach it to others, that'll have big impacts. And I mentioned in here that if you teach kids this stuff, they get it right off the bat, and they become sticklers, I've noticed, for keeping their parents, you know, on track by not getting off of these hardened trails. Like I remember, I often, when we get up on the granite domes of Acadia, you have these exquisite outcrop communities, but they're very fragile. So I, you know, teach kids, you only walk on the granite bedrock. You don't step on exposed sand or dirt. You don't step on any plants. And they get it right away. I think it's like, you know, step on a crack, you break your mama's back, something like that. They get it. And they hone right in on that. And if their parents are not doing it, they will stop them and say, Dad, look what you're stepping on, you know? So I mentioned this, you know, this book, if you can teach your children, they'll keep you honest and teach you well.
Yeah, they're great sponges for information.
Yeah.
And a few more in Vermont. Let's go to the Lake Champlain area, Ferrisburg, Williams Woods. Tell us about why you picked those sites.
Yeah, so Williams Woods is really cool. It's in Charlotte because it's pretty much the last remnant of the original clay plain forest that surrounded what is now Lake Champlain. So um, the Vermont Sea was maybe 5 times larger than Lake Champlain. It formed as the glaciers were departing up into Canada and then eventually drained, leaving Lake Champlain. But that sea was all underlain with marine clays. So when it drained, leaving Lake Champlain, the whole periphery was this unusual clay plain forest. And it has some very unique species like bur oak. There's only 2 places I know of in New England that have bur oak. They're both on these sort of clay plain soils. And the ones in Williams Woods are beautiful old growth specimens, probably around 300 years of age. So it has some really cool features in there that you just are not going to see anywhere else.
Right. And there's a nice trail that the Nature Conservancy has put in
Yeah.
there also.
Yeah.
And then Kingsland Bay State
Yeah.
Park, old growth northern white cedar.
Yeah. And it's underlain by dolomite, so it's calcium and I think you get the most, I think that probably has the most diverse array of trees in a small area that I have seen in any of these sites. And I've seen associations I've never seen before, things like white ash growing right with robust stands of red pine. You know,
Right.
I've never seen before that association. So it's quite nice because you get like a lot of really interesting stuff. And there are, I wouldn't say it's old growth in there, but they're definitely old growth trees in there. There's a good amount of old growth red oak scattered here. There's some old growth sugar maples, some old growth northern white cedar, but not a stand of old growth, but certainly old growth specimens.
Right. And speaking of diversity, maybe one of our last sites is the Bartholomews Cobble down on the border of Connecticut and Massachusetts. Again, an incredible site. You mentioned 800 different plant species and some really interesting diversity with the calcium loving plants.
Exactly. And, here's another, this is the Trustees of Reservation parcel, less than 1,000 acres. It has more species of ferns than anywhere else in all of North America. Now that's something when you have this one preserve that has more fern species diversity than anywhere else in North America. That's really something.
That really is something. Well, thanks, Tom. I'm going to see if there's any questions at this point, and here we go. I'll just stand back here and let folks ask questions.
We do have some questions that have already been submitted. We'll start with 2 from Vicki Brown. She says, I know it's hard to choose, but which of the 30 is your favorite and why? And what is the best to take kids to interest them in ecology?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if I have a favorite because they're all unique in their own way. And I tend to like them all. I'd say the ones that kids would probably really get into would be the ones that have the boardwalks. So those would be the 2 up in Maine, the Orono Bog and the Saco Heath. I think kids also really get charged about walking on exposed, slab ledges. So the Gorham Mountain, also in Maine, would be good. But there's also some areas like that in Mount Agamenticus beyond. These are all happening in Maine, I guess. But the Trap Rock Ridge, certainly down in Connecticut, has that as well. So those 2 would be, I think, natural. And finally, the Dune Shack Trail, I think kids would really find intriguing to walk in the dunes. But, that trail, if you're going to do it with children, you'd want to do it like in the spring or the fall. If you're out there exposed with full sunlight in the summertime, and it's all reflecting off that white sand, it can be really, really hot. So you want to do it at a cooler time of year.
Okay. Kristen Murphy asks, can you explain pillows and pits?
All right. So they're called either pits and mounds or pillows and cradles. So this is the result of live trees being knocked over in the woods by wind or snow or ice floating. So when a tree falls down, its roots rip up, making what's called a tip up. So there's the upturned roots. The area they came out of would be the pit or the cradle. That's going to be the depression. And then when those roots rot, the excavated earth is going to settle to make a mound or a pillow. So you get what's called pit and mound or pillow and cradle topography. In those features, large ones can be visible up to 1,000 years after a live tree has been taken down. And with the pretty robust disturbance regime we have here, from thunderstorm microbursts, nor'easters, occasional hurricanes, wet snow and icing events, after a couple of centuries, our forest floors get really covered in these things, making them look very lumpy. And so I should mention, one of the first things I do if I'm walking into a forest is look at that superficial topography of the ground. If it's lumpy, it tells me I'm in an area that was either always forested, or if it was opened up for agricultural activity, was only opened up for pasture. But if the ground is smooth and even, and you're on glacial till soils, which most of our soils are in New England, that means those pillows and cradles were removed by plowing to either make a crop field or a hay field. So I'm very often, the first thing I'm doing in a forest is looking at the ground to get a sense of its history in that way.
Okay, we have a question from Dave. He mentions Cathedral of the Pines in Cornwall, Connecticut. After the blowdown, a portion was salvaged to remove pines and a portion was left untouched after the microburst. How do these differ today? What has been the effect of salvage versus not salvaged?
Well, the salvaging, you're removing basically that coarse woody debris, and you're removing what are going to be, there's just starting to get going now, what are called nurse logs. So white pine trees, after about 25 years, they shed their bark, and by about 30 years start to develop a mat of moss growing on the trunk. And those trees rot slowly from the outside in. And that mat of moss is a great germination site for small seeded, shade tolerant trees. And down there, that's going to be like hemlock and black birch. So you're starting to get little hemlock and black birch seedlings growing on those logs. So in the area that was salvaged, you're not going to have anything like this. But the future forest of Cathedral of the Pines is going to be a lot of hemlock and black birch, because there's tons of these trunks down in there. And 200 years from now, those trunks will have decayed away, but you're going to have all of these straight lines of trees that grew up on the log, and their above ground roots are going to tie them together in that line. It's going to be a very unique looking forest. There's not many like that we have, but that's what that place is going to look like if it doesn't go through any more disturbance for about another 200 years. So it'll look very different from the salvaged area where that was all removed.
That's very cool. All right. Victoria says, Tom, the breadth and depth of your knowledge is amazing. Is there anything that still puzzles you? What mysteries are still out there in the woods for you?
Well, there are some. I was brought in by archaeologists from the Smithsonian and the Green Mountain National Forest Service to look at some laid up stonework in a site in Rochester, Vermont, that I'm still not completely sure what was going on there. The area it's in was definitely a crop field, but what you have there, these huge stone cairns, for lack of a better word, but when I say huge, like, the big ones are maybe, probably 15 meters long, maybe 8 meters wide, and the front maybe 9 meters high. And it's all laid up stone, and they're flat topped. And the amount of them and the amount of rock that's in there seems like it's way too much to have come off the site. So I've suggested that they take one apart and see how it's constructed. If it was from agricultural activity, the rocks will just be a jumbled mix. These look like they've been stratified because the top was all just very small stones, so you can get up and walk on them. Or they could take a profile underneath them to see if the soil underneath them was never plowed. And if that's the case, that means they predate cultivation. So I'm not sure what they are. We've asked Abenaki elders if they have an idea. They're not sure. They think that it might be a sacred site, so they don't want it touched. But that's a puzzle that I'm not sure what the answer is to it.
Interesting. Someone says, Tom, you mentioned an uncertainty in publishing the book due to concerns of overuse. Are there specific areas that you can think of where excessive use has compromised the site?
Yeah, and there are a number of areas like that I can think of. I mean, actually, Dave and I were talking earlier in the week about one, Sugarloaf Mountain, which is in the White Mountains, on the access road that takes you up to Zealand Notch. And I was going to use that. I hiked up in it, and I discounted it because, one, it's a pretty steep hike for ways to get up there. And I was trying to make trails that were easier. But since the last time I was there, the hiker traffic up there has eradicated the bulk of these outcrop communities, which were the real reason for including it. So there's an example. I think it's sad. I see this a lot in Acadia National Park as well, on the summits, that people, they get up on these areas that have exposed bedrock, and they just think they can walk anywhere. And what they end up doing is walking through these depression and crevice communities, which are exquisite communities, and they eradicate them, basically reducing them down to just bare sand. And so there are sites where I've seen overuse has really eradicated the unique communities.
Okay, Mary asks, I've seen a few perfectly round pits in the woods, like 5 feet diameter, 3 feet deep, but there is no pillow associated with them. No log or tree is around. What has caused these craters?
Well, a good question would be, do you see like a rim of earth around them going all the way around? They might have been starter sites for wells, when they're digging wells. So if that was the case, that might be it. There were some I found down in Connecticut, which really puzzled me until I realized that there were little shards of milky quartz all over the place. So what had happened was quartz boulders had been mined, leaving these circular, basically pits in the ground. And I know that up in Westminster, Vermont, that rock outcrops that had veins of milky quartz also had small veins of silver. So I thought these were being mined for silver. But doing some research, I found out that milky quartz was used as a component in making paints. And I guess these boulders back then were removed for making paints in the early 1900s. But those would be two things I can think of I've seen where they're not pits and mounds, because she's right. Pits and mounds are elongate. They're not circular. But I have seen the start of wells, which are circular with a earthen rim around them, or then these sites that had all these shards of milky quartz.
And Tom, I can think of one other one on the Edmonds Path in the Bretton Woods area, going up Mount Eisenhower. It's a trail, and there's burrow pits along there, and they're about 3 feet deep and about 5 feet around. And all along that trail are these burrow pits that are now starting to grow in. I've seen it along other roads, but some of the trails were done that way too. So that's a possibility.
Yeah, exactly. It excavate earth to actually make the trail tread and level it out. Yep.
Can you explain what a burrow pit is?
It's just a place where earth and material was removed for usually the road construction, in this case, trail construction, whatever else. And these small ones would be for trails. If you're looking at ones for roads, they're often way bigger, and they're often, a cutout of an embankment where a large amount of material was taken away.
Okay. Dave asks another question. Tom's The Myth of Progress addresses contemporary land use and environmental policy. How do you feel today, or do you have recommendations for anthropogenic impacts on ecological communities or the effects of climate change occurring in real time?
Well, that's a big question now. Yeah, I think we're seeing climate change occurring in real time. I'd say this year, and I'd say not just this year, last year, a number of years are wake-up calls. I mean, one thing is just looking at the levels of floods that we have had across the globe. I mean, we just recently had this amazing one down in New York City, and of course, a terrible one down in Tennessee earlier, and of course, many ones across the globe. I'd say that's climate change in real action. We're seeing it along with the fires. And Dave and I were talking the other day that, we're hearing a lot about our fires in this country, but Siberia, the fires there have consumed 10 times as much forest. So they've burned off this burn season 67,000 square miles of forest land. So these are shockingly big changes. And I think I'm seeing definitely in terms of ecological changes, I'm mostly seeing it in insect populations moving northward. So I remember that my parents lived down in Connecticut, seeing carpenter bees down there. Well, they just showed up at my place up here in Elstead, New Hampshire this year. I've never seen them up here before. About 8 years ago, showed up. 15 years ago, a late fall mosquito, a very small one, showed up. So you're seeing definitely expansion of insect ranges coming northward. Matter of fact, just yesterday, I was in a really enriched site and saw, this is over in Putney, Vermont, and found mayapple. I've never seen that up in the state of Vermont. I don't know if, Dave, you've come across it anywhere in Vermont or New Hampshire, but I haven't.
Massachusetts, but
yeah. But I was shocked. And so things are marching northwards, there's no doubt.
What happens when a non-native insect moves north? What happens to the trees?
Well, if it's non-native, that's sort of a range expansion. Yeah. But I think that we're probably going to see at a slower rate our trees moving northward too. But if we're getting, let's say, non-native pathogens, well, that's problematic because the trees they're attacking have not co-evolved with them. We have a lot of, things that were pathogens that are no more. I don't know if people have seen oak ball galls. These are round, green, hollow galls that grow on the undersides of oak leaves. Well, studies have shown that this is actually a mutually beneficial relationship. This started off as probably a pretty nasty parasitism of leaves, but the amount of embedded energy in the gall is way less than the amount of photosynthesis it conducts during the growing season. So actually any leaf that gets energy coming back to it. So that was a change in relationship through a co-evolved process. So in time, I think, as I was mentioning, I think pretty much all of our trees and pathogens are going to work things out. It's going to take a long time, but I am still concerned about the beech because of the way selection is happening there.
Let's have one last question here, again from Vicky, before we wrap up for the night. Speaking of climate change, what are your thoughts on assisted migration for plants?
I think it's something we ought to be trying. I know they're trying it in Acadia National Park. They've been planting in nurseries up there, southern species like tulip tree and things like that, because they're very worried that red spruce is the most common tree on that island. 40% of it is red spruce, and the spruce are not very hardy, and they're worried that they're going to lose them. And they're thinking for resiliency, if it really warms up quickly, which it is in the Gulf of Maine, that maybe we ought to have some southern species up here that can start to acclimate. So I think it's something we ought to be probably experimenting with and checking it out. Because the rate at which change is going to happen so fast. Tree migration, except if you're like a very small windblown tree seed, it's slow. And so I think to have more resiliency, we ought to be, I think, playing around with that a bit.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to ask one silly question to each of you. What's your favorite tree?
Oh, you're asking me? You're not asking all the participants, are you?
I mean, they could tell us too. I like a beech tree, but what's your favorite tree?
All right, I didn't really have a favorite tree until we started spending a lot of time up on Mount Desert Island in Maine. And so I think that northern white cedar has become my favorite tree. It has a number of attributes. One, it's our oldest growing tree in the Northeast United States, getting up to 1,200 years of age. Each individual is uniquely different. It root grafts more frequently with other trees than any other tree I've seen. And it seems to be more frequently hit by lightning than any other tree. So it must be a very good conductor. So it has a lot of intriguing attributes.
All
and
right.
In the Northeast, my favorite tree is the tamarack or eastern larch, but worldwide, I think my favorite is the bristlecone pine found in the other White Mountains of California. So I like those.
Excellent. I love when people who spend time outdoors start debating the merits of plants. I absolutely adore it. So thank you so much to the two of you for joining us here at Gibson's Bookstore for this book. New England's Roadside Ecology is available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we're ordering more in. You folks have been wonderful in supporting Tom's book launch, and we've had so many copies ordered. We're on like our second or third order from the publisher, so congratulations to you. And thank you to everybody who joined us this evening and for asking questions. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you very much, too.
Thank
you too, Dave.
Thank you very much.